guys, today I'd like to talk about blood. I'm going to give you a short lecture on blood. I'm going to move pretty fast, so feel free to review this material in the book, but here we go. So blood is important. If we remember, we had talked about kind of the function of blood. Blood is a transport medium, basically. This is what carries important things around our body. It carries a bunch of different stuff. It carries things like waste, so just dissolved nitrogenous waste. It carries nutrients like glucose, like some amino acids, like some fatty acids. It carries hormones. It carries gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide. It also is responsible for carrying proteins around our body. And another function of blood is that it helps to distribute heat. So one thing, if you have poor circulation, one symptom of that is having cold hands and feet, because the blood helps to distribute this warm heat around our body pretty evenly. Okay. So another thing it distributes is ions. Okay. Now blood is made up of a couple of different components. Okay, if you were to take a vial of blood and put it into a centrifuge, which spins it around, this will separate the different layers based on their density. You'll have the heaviest layer at the bottom and the lightest layers at the top. So let me just show what this would look like. Here, imagine you had a vial. Okay, this is just going to be a vial of blood. It looks like that. At the bottom, you're going to have the densest layer of the blood. This is called the hematocrit. Okay. So it's going to be red in color. This is going to be along the bottom. This layer down here, these are essentially red blood cells, also known as hematocrit, Hematocrit. And this constitutes about 45% of the blood volume. It's also the densest. As we'll learn, this is essentially just a bunch of red blood cells. On top of this layer, you're going to have a very thin layer. Okay, this thin layer, these are our white blood cells. Another name for those are leukocytes, Leukocyte. Let me spell it out. Leukocyte. These guys constitute about 1% of the blood volume. And in these white blood cells, you will find things like neutrophils. You'll have your lymphocytes, your monocytes, your basophils, eosinophils. In addition, you'll have your platelets. But as you'll notice, there's a lot fewer white blood cells than there are red blood cells. Okay. The lightest layer is going to be on top. This is going to be your plasma. And the plasma is going to comprise, give or take, about 54-55% of your blood volume. Now plasma, if we talk about what's in the plasma is 90% water, so most of it's water. But in addition, all the things the blood carries, like all the ions, all the nutrients, all the wastes, that's what's dissolved in this plasma, okay? In addition to all of those other things, plasma contains quite a few proteins. Some of those proteins, they're one of the most important ones, are called albumin. Okay, that's Albumin. Albumin is very important because albumin helps to balance out the osmotic pressure inside the blood versus the body tissues. Here's an example of kind of how that works. If I were to draw, I don't know, like a little capillary right here. Imagine this is the little capillary. So everything is inside the blood is here, this is outside the blood. Turns out that the saltiness inside the blood isn't nearly as much as the saltiness outside the blood. There's just more stuff in the extracellular fluid. Makes it more salty. And if we remember, according to osmosis, if water were to move in this situation, water follows salt, so you would have a bunch of fluid that would leave the blood vessel. And that would be very bad because our blood volume would go down to hardly anything and we would die. To prevent this from happening, what we'll do is that we'll place some relatively large proteins that like to hang out in the blood itself. One of these proteins is called albumin. This functions as a placeholder to balance out osmotic pressure so the water doesn't leave. Another example of a protein that's really important are the globulin proteins. We have alpha globulins, beta globulins, and gamma globulins. alpha and beta globulins, these are just carrier proteins that allow us to transport lipids in our blood. If there's anything we remember about lipids is that they don't dissolve in water, so it's hard to carry around a fatty acid or whatnot around our body if the blood is mostly plasma and that plasma is 90% water. Okay, so a trick that we'll use is we'll take these alpha and beta globulins, which bind the fatty acids, and they allow us to carry those lipids throughout our bodies. Another globulin is the gamma globulins. These are antibodies that are produced by our white blood cells that are very effective or very important in the immune response. Okay, so that's kind of the deal with plasma. Let's talk about red blood cells. All right, so one of these red blood cells, so the hematocrit is made up by billions and billions of these red blood cells. A red blood cell looks like this. So get the better red here. Red blood cell looks like this. Kind of looks like one of those frisbees that you use as a dog toy, kind of this flexible frisbee that's a little bit thinner in the middle. The diameter of a red blood cell is about 8 micrometers. If you remember, there's 1,000 micrometers in a millimeter, so if we were to round this up to 10, that means you would have to line up 100 red blood cells to get a millimeter. Turns out that if you were to measure the diameter of one of our capillaries, we can just extend this out, this being one of our capillaries. The diameter of one of the capillaries is about 8 micrometers itself, so these red blood cells will flow down the capillaries in a single file line. That's really kind of what they look like as they flow through the capillaries. Okay. These red blood cells, they don't have a nucleus. They're essentially just a cell membrane that contain a bunch of a very important type of protein. This important type of protein is called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin looks like this. So here's a molecule of hemoglobin. The abbreviation for hemoglobin is HB. It consists of 4 globin groups. 2 alpha globins, which are right here in blue, and then 2 beta globins, which are right here in green. In the middle of each one of these globin groups, you're going to have a very important heme group. That's Heme. This heme group is going to be located right here. It's red in color because it contains an element of iron. Let me label that. This is globin. We have alpha here, beta here, and this is heme group. And it contains 1 element of iron for each heme group. The importance of these heme groups is those heme groups can reversibly bind to one molecule of oxygen. So a single hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. This is important because oxygen is really not that soluble in water. And this allows us to cram a lot more oxygen into blood than we would normally be able to if we didn't have hemoglobin. In fact, if we didn't have hemoglobin, our hearts would have to beat 15 times faster, or we'd have to have 15 times more blood to satisfy the needs of our tissues. That's because hemoglobin carries about 98% of our blood's oxygen. About 20% of our blood's CO2 is carried by hemoglobin, but it's not on the heme group, it's actually around the border or along these globin groups. Okay. Now, it's important to talk about this. A single red blood cell can float around the body for a couple of months, maybe like 120 days, before it gets kind of old, it's not so flexible. Then we need to recycle this blood. A huge job, this is a huge job of the spleen. You'll have old red blood cells that go to the spleen. Macrophages there will consume these old red blood cells. They will recycle the heme group, send those down to the liver for use in the making of new red blood cells. And they'll basically tear apart these globin groups. When they do that, they convert the globin groups to another protein called bilirubin. Bilirubin circulates around our bloodstream, and it's the job of the liver to take all this bilirubin, convert it to a water-soluble form of bilirubin, and just dump it into our digestive tract where we get rid of it. Bilirubin is yellow in color, so if our liver can't keep up with the demand that it has to convert this bilirubin in our bloodstream into a water-soluble form that we inject into our gut, then this yellow bilirubin pigment collects in our tissues. That's jaundice, and it's an indication that the liver isn't functioning so well. Okay. Now, let's talk about the process in which blood is made. This is the process called hematopoiesis. This is when the production of new red blood cells. This occurs in the bone marrow. Basically, what you start with is you start off with a stem cell. This stem cell could become a red blood cell, or it could become any of the leukocytes. We'll have a stem cell that will commit to becoming a red blood cell. This guy is now called an erythroblast. He's still in the bone marrow. And this erythroblast has a really big job to do. First thing he does is he starts cranking out ribosomes. Ribosomes are the organelles, if you remember. These guys make proteins. The one protein that he needs to make a lot of is hemoglobin. That's because each red blood cell contains 250 million molecules of hemoglobin. So this guy's got to make a ton of hemoglobin. Not a ton, he's got to make 250 million. And so he just starts cranking out ribosomes, and as he cranks out ribosomes, these ribosomes start cranking out hemoglobin. So eventually, hemoglobin will collect inside this young erythroblast, right? When he's collected enough, what will happen is that erythroblast ejects out its nucleus and all the organelles, and now what you have is you have a bag full of just a cell membrane that contains nothing but hemoglobin. This is a young red blood cell, which is called a reticulocyte. So if I were to label this, you've got an erythroblast, and a reticulocyte. Okay, and this is a stem cell. That reticulocyte leaves the bone marrow, he goes into the circulation, and he acts like a red blood cell, he just looks a little different. We can count the amount of reticulocytes you have, and that gives you an indication of how quickly your body is undergoing hematopoiesis. The level of oxygen in your blood is an indicator of it tells your body how quickly it needs to make red blood cells. The kidneys measure this, they measure the blood oxygen level. When it gets low, this stimulates the kidneys to release a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin stimulates the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. And when it does this, it makes more red blood cells. More red blood cells typically means that it can carry more oxygen. That's going to raise the oxygen levels back up to normal. Someone who's anemic just means that you have a low iron content or you have a low amount of red blood cells. Someone who has anemia is going to have a very low or very high amount of reticulocytes. They have this because their blood oxygen level is very low. If you don't have iron, you don't have these heme groups, and that's what allows you to store, you don't have as many of these heme groups, and that allows you to store oxygen in your blood. So if you're anemic, your iron levels are low, you don't have a lot of functioning hemoglobin, so your blood oxygen is low. And if this happens, it's going to cause your kidneys to release more erythropoietin. That's going to stimulate hematopoiesis. These red blood cells are being made, but there's not any iron to put in the hemoglobin, but your body still cranks out a large amount of red blood cells. That's going to cause someone who has anemia, their red blood cells literally look like little hollow bags because they don't have a lot of hemoglobin in them. Okay? This process called hematopoiesis takes about 2 weeks to complete from the stem cell to the reticulocyte. But you've got about 2 million red blood cells being made every second, so we're constantly cranking out new red blood cells. All right. And there's one more kind of condition I'd like to mention, that's called sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a mutation in one amino acid that encodes for hemoglobin, and that causes the red blood cells to assume a sickle, or almost like banana-like shape. These sickle cells aren't nearly as pliable, and they're often get caught in these tiny capillaries causing a bunch of microclots. They also aren't nearly as efficient at carrying oxygen, so this is a major disadvantage for someone who has sickle cell anemia. However, someone who has sickle cell anemia is immune to malaria, which is a parasite which infects the humans and invades the red blood cells as part of their life cycle. So in areas where malaria is high, the prevalence of malaria is high, you're also going to have a selective pressure that causes the sickle cell gene to be more widespread because malaria is such a deadly disease. So this is a really rapid overview. Please refer to your book for more information. Thanks.